Hello, my name is Jordan Stone, and I'm a United States expert with Enhesa. Today, I'll be walking through major U.S. product compliance developments from the first half of 2026 and what you should be watching out for during the second half of the year. A major theme playing out is that product compliance has become more and more state-driven. States are no longer waiting for steps to be taken at the federal level and are instead pushing out their own regulations. PFAS remains the clearest example of this trend. In the first half of the year, state PFAS activity continued to expand rapidly with over 100 new PFAS bills proposed, carried over bills, and laws moving into implementation. Kentucky, for example, introduced House Bill 196 to establish a comprehensive framework for monitoring and managing PFAS. The bill would require manufacturers producing PFAS containing products to submit to the Secretary for the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet both 1. A report with product descriptions, PFAS contents by chemical abstract service registry number, and manufacturer identification, and 2. An annual report on PFAS releases into the environment. Companies would also be prohibited from selling a covered product if the product's manufacturer has not provided the required reports. The bill would further establish a PFAS working group and create reporting requirements for manufacturers that intentionally add PFAS to products manufactured for sale or distribution in Kentucky. In Michigan, House Bill 5890 was introduced to create the Hazardous Products Act and prohibit the manufacture for sale of numerous products containing intentionally added PFAS beginning January 1st, 2027. The prohibition would apply to a broad range of consumer products, including apparel, carpets and rugs, cleaning products, cookware, cosmetics, dental floss, fabric treatments, juvenile products, menstrual products, textile furnishing, ski wax, and upholstered furniture. Although certain items, such as personal protective equipment or PPE, and military use products would be exempt. Additionally, companies would be subject to potential criminal charges and private lawsuits for violations, such as up to 93 days imprisonment, a fine of up to 1,000 USD, or both for first offenses. While many states have proposed PFAS legislation, others, such as New Jersey, have already adopted PFAS restrictions, including a law requiring disclosures for firefighting PPE containing PFAS, and prohibiting the sale, manufacture, and distribution of certain firefighting PPE with intentionally added PFAS. This is a perfect example of how states are increasingly targeting specific high-priority product categories rather than waiting for a comprehensive federal PFAS products law. While states are increasingly taking the lead on regulating for PFAS in products, PFAS in water has continued to be a major federal issue. This can especially be seen with the United States Environmental Protection Agency's EPA proposal to rescind regulations for four PFAS: PFHXS, PFNA, Gen X chemicals, and hazard index mixtures for these three PFAS, plus PFBS under the Safe Drinking Waters Act. If finalized, the proposal would remove the federal drinking water standards for these substances while retaining standards for PFOA and PFOS, potentially, reducing monitoring and treatment obligations for some public water systems. Along with EPA's proposed rescission of certain PFAS drinking water standards, states such as Delaware and Illinois have adopted EPA's 2024 PFAS National Primary Drinking Water Regulation by reference. By incorporating the federal rule into state regulations, these states have codified enforceable PFAS drinking water standards at the state level, which could allow them to maintain these requirements even if EPA ultimately rescinds portions of the federal rule. Extended producer responsibility, or EPR, also remained a significant area of state activity during the first half of 2026. While packaging remains the primary focus, lawmakers continue to debate how the costs of collecting, recycling, and managing packaging materials should be allocated between producers, consumers, and local governments. As a result, several states considered creating producer-funded systems that would require manufacturers, brand owners, and importers to finance recycling and waste management programs for packaging and paper products. One of the most closely watched proposals was New York's Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, which would have required producers of covered packaging and paper products to finance and manage the collection, recycling, reuse, and end of life management of those materials through a producer responsibility organization, or PRO. The bill would also establish packaging reduction requirements, recyclability standards, post-consumer recycled content requirements, and restrictions on certain substances in packing. If adopted, it would represent one of the most comprehensive packaging EPR frameworks under consideration in the United States. New Jersey also considered Senate Bill 614, which would establish a packaging EPR program requiring producers of packaging products to participate in a PRO and fund the collection, transportation, recycling, and management of covered packaging materials. The bill would also require the development of producer responsibility plans, establish performance standards and reporting obligations, and create a framework for increasing packaging recycling and diversion rates throughout the state. In addition to PFAS and EPR developments, EPA continued implementation of the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, during the first half of 2026. EPA remained focused on risk management requirements for existing chemicals, including substances such as asbestos, methylene chloride, 1-propamine, perchloroethylene, and trichloroethylene. While PFAS and product-specific state laws often receive the most attention, TSCA continues to shape chemical management obligations at the federal level and can affect manufacturers, importers, processors, distributors, and downstream product companies through restrictions on manufacturing, import, use, record keeping, and workplace controls. Looking ahead, we will continue to see PFAS remain the highest volume state legislative issue. EPR is moving from adoption into implementation, and TSCA is moving through federal risk management and reporting changes. As we look ahead to the second half of 2026 and beyond, much of the PFAS activity won't come just from new legislative proposals, but also from the implementation of laws that states have already enacted. States are increasingly moving beyond discussing PFAS regulation and into the phase of developing guidance, preparing compliance programs, and establishing the frameworks needed to enforce product restrictions and reporting obligations. New Jersey's Protecting Against Forever Chemicals Act is one example, as manufacturers and regulators begin preparing for upcoming restrictions on intentionally added PFAS in a variety of consumer products. Specifically, the Act's product restrictions become effective on January 12, 2028, giving manufacturers time to evaluate products, reformulate where necessary, and prepare for compliance. On the same date, cookware with PFAS in handles or food contact surfaces must either eliminate those substances or comply with specific labeling requirements, informing consumers that the product contains PFAS. At the same time, we are likely to see states continue introducing and reintroducing legislation that builds on policy concepts that have already gained traction elsewhere. During the 2026 legislative session, states considered measures ranging from broad product restrictions to PFAS reporting requirements and disclosure programs. For example, Michigan lawmakers introduced House Bill 5890, which would prohibit intentionally added PFAS in numerous household and consumer products, while Kentucky considered House Bill 196, which would establish a PFAS working group and create reporting requirements for manufacturers that intentionally add PFAS to products sold or distributed in Kentucky. The bill would also require reporting of PFAS releases in the Commonwealth and establish penalties for noncompliance. Even where those proposals did not advance in 2026, they provide a strong indication of the type of measures we could see return in 2027. Looking at PFAS in water, PFAS in drinking water is expected to remain a significant regulatory issue, even as the federal approach continues to evolve. EPA has indicated that if it finalizes the proposed rescission of PFNA, PFHXS, HFPODA, and the hazardous index mixture, it will still evaluate additional PFAS in drinking water for a possible future regulation through the Safe Drinking Water Act process. As a result, regulatory attention on PFAS in water is unlikely to diminish even if the scope of federal requirements change. At the state level, activity is expected to remain strong regardless of federal developments. Several states, such as Delaware, Illinois, and New Hampshire, have already adopted, incorporated, or are moving forward with drinking water requirements, monitoring programs, and PFAS-related water standards, and others may continue to pursue independent action where they believe federal requirements do not go far enough. Together, these examples show that states remain willing to pursue their own regulatory approaches to PFAS in drinking water and may continue to expand or update these programs beyond 2026. PFAS in drinking water therefore remains a federal issue, even though the scope and timeline may change. However, companies should focus on state actions also, as many states are expected to continue regulating these substances independently, resulting in a growing patchwork of state requirements. Similar to the evolution we've seen with PFAS, packaging EPR is no longer defined solely by new legislative proposals, while states continue to consider new EPR laws. An increasing number of jurisdictions are now entering the implementation phase. Several U.S. states have enacted for packaging or packaging and paper products, such as California, Colorado, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, Oregon, Washington have started in the second half of 2026. Companies will see more activity around producer registration, producer responsibility organizations, reporting, needs assessments, early fee structures, and program planning. For example, Washington's Recycling Reform Act, which was enacted in 2025, creates an EPR program for residential packaging and paper products. The program requires producers to join and fund a nonprofit producer responsibility organization, and program implementation is occurring in phases with registration and assessments first, program development next, and broader implementation expected later in the decade. With implementation of the program beginning on January 1st, 2026, it continues into the second half of the year by requiring producers to be a member of a PRO by July 1st, 2026, have the PRO make its initial implementation payment to the Washington Department of Ecology by September 1st, 2026, and requires the state to complete a preliminary statewide needs assessment by December 31st, 2026, which may later be used to revise the program. These early milestones matter as they create the data and funding structure for the program before full implementation begins. Like Washington State, Maryland has also begun implementing its packaging and paper products EPR program following the adoption of SB 901, the Packaging and Paper Products Producer Responsibility Plans Law. Although full program implementation is not expected until 2028, the state is already laying the groundwork through a series of agency-led implementation activities. By the end of 2026, the Maryland Office of Recycling must complete a preliminary statewide recycling needs assessment, which will help identify gaps in the current recycling system and inform the design of the future program. Looking ahead to 2027, Maryland must develop its statewide list of recyclable and compostable covered materials, a key step in determining which materials will be managed under the program. Producers and producer responsibility organizations will then need to prepare for the next major milestone, submitting producer responsibility plans to the Maryland Department of Environment by July 1st, 2028. At the federal level, TSCA remains one of the most important U.S. chemical management programs to watch because it provides EPA with the authority to evaluate chemicals already in commerce and, when necessary, impose restrictions to address unreasonable risks. Over the past several years, EPA has increasingly used this authority to move beyond chemical assessment and into risk management, resulting in significant restrictions for chemicals that are used across numerous industrial and commercial sectors. Recent examples include risk management for rules for TCE, methylene chloride, PCE, which impose prohibitions, workplace controls, and compliance obligations on manufacturers, processors, distributors, commercial users, and other regulated entities. These actions demonstrate EPA's continued focus on reducing occupational and consumer exposure to chemicals that the agency has determined to present unreasonable risk. As a result, TSCA is increasingly influencing not only chemical manufacturers, but also downstream users that rely on these substances in manufacturing processes, maintaining operations, and finished products. Looking forward, EPA's regulatory agenda indicates that chemical management activity under TSCA is unlikely to slow. EPA is expected to continue work on risk management actions involving chemicals such as carbon tetrachloride, formaldehyde, HBCD, DNIP, and DIDP, while also considering amendments, compliance date adjustments, and implementation-related actions for recently finalized rules involving PCE and TCE. The second half of 2026 and beyond will be less about identifying emerging trends and more about watching those trends take shape through implementation, compliance deadlines, and new regulatory proposals. Whether it's PFAS, TSCA risk management, or EPR programs, organizations should stay informed and engaged to be best positioned to navigate this evolving regulatory landscape.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Laura, and I am a Senior EHS and Sustainability Regulatory Consultant here at Enhesa. Today, I will be presenting the European Union section, bringing you some of the key developments in product compliance to be aware of in the second half of 2026, and more importantly, what these developments mean for companies over the next few months. I will do a quick recap, as in May this year, my colleague already highlighted the EU chemical regulatory updates for 2026, drawing special attention to the PFAS universal proposal, the REACH regulation update, which included the expansion of the substances of very high concern list, and several omnibus amendments, among others, affecting the cosmetics regulation. Today, we will revisit one of these topics and further explore key product regulations and developments adopted or expected to be adopted in the EU for the second half of the year and into 2027. The EU product compliance story for this period is not one single deadline, but rather a convergence of design, data, substances, packaging, and circularity obligations. In particular, we will explore developments to look out for concerning the EU packaging and packaging waste regulation, and inseparably with that, the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, known as the ESPR, and its Digital Product Passport, the DPP. I will move on to then the EU-wide PFAS restriction proposal to finalize with the textiles updates on ESPR, extended producer responsibility, and the unsold goods rules. While this may appear to be three separate issues, there is a common thread running throughout all of them, which is that the EU is fundamentally changing the way products are regulated. Historically, compliance was often about demonstrating that a product met a specific requirement at a specific moment in time. However, today, compliance is completely something much bigger, demonstrating continuous transparency across a product's entire life cycle. That's what it is about today. This shift is what I will explore today, and we will start with the EU packaging and packaging waste regulation. This regulation entered into force on 11th February 2025 and became broadly applicable on 12th August 2026, with rollout requirements extending through to 2040, including packaging bans and reuse targets by 2030. I will touch upon them a bit afterwards. The regulation repealed and replaced the previous directive, introducing clearer, stricter, and more uniform requirements with a focus on transitioning towards a circular economy. What makes this regulation different from the previous directive and any previous packaging rule for that matter is that it regulates the entire packaging life cycle. It starts from design, goes into manufacturing, labeling, use, reuse, recycling, and finally waste management. And as the name indicates, it is a regulation and not a directive, and means it applies directly across the EU. To prepare stakeholders for the correct application and implementation of the regulation, the European Commission published several press releases providing guidances to facilitate the uniform application of the regulation across both economic actors and member states during the first half of 2026. Notably, on 5th June 2026, it published a guidance document for the correct implementation of the regulation, and 2 months later, on 3rd August 2026, it published a frequently asked questions page, further clarifying definitions, concepts, and implementation dates, like how extended producer responsibility obligations apply, what is considered packaging, or how PFAS restriction in food contact packaging will be enforced. Moreover, at the end of February of this year, of 2026, we also saw the first Commission Delegated Act, which was Commission Delegated Act 2026/409, which exempted certain economic operators that use pallet wrappings and straps from the 100% reuse requirements of these packaging formats. And even though this may seem a niche topic, this first delegated act tells us something more. Secondary legislation will play a crucial role in determining how the regulation works and is applied in practice. Many details companies are waiting for will come through implementing and delegating acts over the next few years. Now, let's dive deeper into what the obligations and timeline are for companies. As the regulation applies to all packaging, regardless of material, and to all packaging waste from industry, manufacturing, retail, distribution, offices, services, and even households. Firstly, companies must ensure that their packaging is recyclable at scale. That means that by 2030, all packaging must be recyclable at scale, and by 2035, packaging must be both recyclable and effectively recycled at scale, meaning that 30% for wood and at least 55% of all other packaging categories are successfully recycled EU-wide. In the second place, companies must also use minimum levels of recycled content in plastic packaging. For example, they must use 10% by 2030 for food contact sensitive plastics, which also will be increased by 2040 to 25%. Companies must also reduce the packaging waste and optimize packaging design, which means that packaging weight and volume must be minimized while still ensuring functionality. For example, also the regulation includes bans on certain single-use plastics packaging types from 2030 onwards, for example, very lightweight fresh produce or hotel toiletry bottles. In the first place, companies must also implement reuse and refill solutions, which are systems designed for packaging collection and reusability to increase that share of reusable packaging that they put in the market. Lastly, they also must comply with harmonized labeling requirement, including standardized labels that indicate the material composition for recyclability or the disposal instructions for consumers. From 12th August 2028 or 24th months after the relevant implementing act is approved, packaging must carry harmonized material composition labels to facilitate sorting, and reusable packaging must, from 20th February 2029 or later, depending on the implementing act, have its own label or data carrier rules. This is critically where the EU law requires product information via data carrier. The regulation requires a single data carrier for the packaged product and the packaging information, which is where the regulation, the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, intersects directly with the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, the ESPR, and the Digital Product Passport architecture. The ESPR provides the framework for introducing sustainability requirements across a wide range of products sold in the EU. And when many companies looked at the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, they see a packaging regulation. And even that, in fact, it is true, it is not the bigger picture. This Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation is part of a much larger transformation towards circularity, as I already advanced in the beginning, which is an EU-connected framework where products, packaging, materials, substances all become traceable and digitally documented. From the obligations I just mentioned, we can see that companies will increasingly need data on, among others, packaging, composition, recyclability performances, and this is where the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation and the ESPR begin to intersect. This intersection is another glimpse into the EU's efforts to harmonize and create an integrated information flows across member states and the entire value chain. The DPP, the Digital Product Passport, becomes then the mechanism that can bring all of that information together. And this is now actually a reality As on 16th July 2026, the European Commission published a Commission Implementing Regulation 2026/1778, laying down the implementation arrangements for the Digital Product Passport Registry. 4 days later, on 20th July 2026, the DPP registry then was officially launched, marking an important milestone as companies can now begin preparing for the actual digital infrastructure that will support their future product passports. We can see now an indicative timeline established by the Commission to implement the DPP requirements and infrastructure, starting, of course, with the DPP registry that has already been launched. Then in Q4 of this year, iron and steel sector-specific DPP requirements will start applying. From 18th February 2027, the requirements for certain batteries will start applying. And finally, between Q3 and Q4 of 2027, this will be applied for textiles, aluminium, and tires. This timeline is indicative and it's subject to the publication of the related delegated acts or sector legislation. So even if a company's product is not covered yet by a DPP requirement, meaning it's not still entered into force, many organizations are already collecting the exact data that a future DPP will likely require. This DPP will actually expose information gaps in organizations, as many do not have yet a complete view into their product's material composition, supplier declaration, recycled or chemical content of their products. Therefore, the most successful companies will not only approach the packaging and packaging waste regulation, the ESPR, or the DPP as separate compliance projects, but as one whole interconnected framework. And as far as this interconnected framework, it is worth mentioning PFAS. As we know, PFAS are still facing growing regulatory attention globally because they remain in the environment for long periods of time and pose significant health and environmental risks. In that sense, it is worth highlighting that as of 12th August 2026, food contact packaging is subject to specific PFAS limits. For example, one of the thresholds is 25 parts per billion ppb for any targeted PFAS. The Commission must also prepare, with ECHA's support, a report by 31st December of this year on the substances of concern in packaging and packaging components, including whether they affect the reuse or recycling or the chemical safety. What does this mean in practice? It means that packaging compliance teams can no longer assume PFAS is solely a REACH or a chemicals issue. It must be assessed whether PFAS are present in food contact materials, and particularly their thresholds must be analyzed and not exceeded. Turning now our view fully to PFAS, we must touch base with the proposed EU-wide PFAS ban, where we can see that PFAS not only overlaps with the packaging and packaging waste regulation, but also it remains one of the most important chemical regulatory developments. In 2023, the first EU-wide universal PFAS restriction proposal was submitted, covering more than 10,000 types of PFAS and affecting numerous sectors, including textiles or consumer products. And in August 2025, the ECHA updated said proposal to include more sectors of assessment, such as certain medical uses or machinery. And regulators are also exploring options other than a complete ban, which would permit the regulated use of PFAS in certain fields, like in electronics, energy, provided that strict conditions, of course, are met. And during this first half of 2026, ECHA's committees, in particular the Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis, the SEAC, and the Committee for Risk Assessment, have been evaluating the proposal and have adopted a draft opinion and a final opinion, respectively, in March 2026, where they supported a broad restriction while recognizing targeted derogations where evidence shows that alternatives are not available and where cost benefits would justify proportionality. ECHA's 60-day SEAC consultation ran to 25th May 2026 and is expected to adopt its final opinion by the end of 2026, after which opinions go to the European Commission for a draft amendment to the list of restrictions, and then following the legislative proposal from the Commission, the European Parliament and the Council will negotiate said proposal, and if they agree, then the universal PFAS restriction would become binding. Even though the final restriction has not yet been adopted, companies should not wait to start preparing. And then what can companies do? Firstly, they should identify where PFAS may exist in their products, in their packaging processes, starting with high likelihood areas such as food contact packaging, water, oil repellents, textiles. And then they should prioritize legal deadlines already adopted, like the PFAS for food contact packaging, or the firefighting foam restrictions that already started in 23rd of October 2026. They must also then collect supplier declarations and analytical evidence that match the product risk level and understand whether PFAS-free alternatives already exist for these products or processes and classify the uses by substitution readiness. Then they should prepare the regulation evidence where it is relevant. For example, if a use may need a transition period or a derogation, the document technical function, alternatives assessments, exposure or emissions controls. And then, of course, they must watch the end of 2026 for the SEAC final opinion and the subsequent commission process. Even though no final compliance date for the broad PFAS restriction exists, until an adopted restriction is published, it's still worth keeping an eye on it. Companies then that know where PFAS exist in their portfolios will be able to respond much faster than companies that only begin investigating after the restrictions and the actual legal text is adopted. And now let's move on to the last topic for the EU, which are textile products. And here I want to highlight a couple of things. We'll highlight a look back into textiles and apparel identified as the highest priority sectors under ESPR and EPR requirements under the revised Waste Framework Directive, and then the ESPR ban on destruction of unsold apparel, clothing, accessories, and footwear that entered into force on 19th July 2026. Firstly, let's look back to April 2025, when the European Commission adopted its 2025-2023 working plan for the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation and the Energy Labeling Regulation. In said working plan, the Commission officially identified textiles and apparel as one of the highest priority sectors under ESPR, confirming that textiles will be among the first sectors subject to detailed eco-design requirements. The indicative timeline for textile delegated acts is 2027, and that would set potential requirements for companies, including durability, recyclability, fiber composition disclosures obligations. And now forwarding a bit more to 16th October 2025, when the revised Waste Framework Directive entered into force, it introduced an EU-wide textile extended producer responsibility, EPR. This directive gives member states 20 months to transpose the directive into national legislation and 30 months to establish EPR schemes. For companies, this means that Q4 of 2026 and 2027 will be the preparation phase. Producers will have to finance collection and management of textile waste. EPR fees will increasingly be linked to sustainability performance. More durable and recyclable products could ultimately benefit from lower fees, and products that are difficult to recycle may become more expensive to place on the market. And finally, from 19th July 2026, large companies across the EU are prohibited from destroying unsold clothing, accessories, and footwear. Medium-sized companies will be subject to the same rules from 2030 onwards. The measure introduced under the ESPR aims to prevent the waste of valuable products and the resources used to make them. When usable products are thrown away, the resources such as raw materials, water, energy, and the labor used to make them are wasted, and their disposal leads to unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. And then what does that mean for companies? According to this new provision, companies are required to focus on keeping products in circulation by selling them, including through discounts, alternative sales channels, donating them to charities or social organizations, or preparing them for reuse through repair, refurbishment, or remanufacturing. The destruction of products is permitted only in specific situations and must follow the waste treatment hierarchy, while with recycling given priority. There's an exception to the ban where they are allowed to destroy unsold clothing and footwear only in certain cases, such as when the items are unsafe, damaged, counterfeit, or violate intellectual property, among others. To prevent abuse of this exception, companies must provide evidence such as documentation or test results and publish annual reports detailing what has been destroyed. To simplify reporting, businesses will use existing customs and logistic codes, and small and micro-sized businesses are not subject to the requirements that I've just mentioned. And after all this information, what to expect in the next 12 to 24 months? Here you can see a small forward-looking watch list where we can see that as of August 2026, throughout to December 2026, the packaging and packaging waste regulation application becomes broadly applicable, including the PFAS food contact packaging thresholds. Why it matters, because then companies must start preparing their documentation, and they must start analyzing the market surveillance and everything they need to get the packaging ready. In Q4 of 2026 is expected the final PFAS opinion of the SEAC, and that would mean then that the process onto the European Commission and the legislative process of the universal PFAS restriction becomes a reality. Then in Q4 2026 throughout to 2027, the digital passport product sector requirements rules begin. And that means that companies must start testing the registry, they must start getting acquainted with the data architecture and the digital product passport information that they need. Throughout 2027, ESPR Textile Delegated Act is expected, and that would mean more specific ESPR and sustainability requirements for textile products. And throughout 2027, 2028, EPR for textiles must be applied by member states. And then companies will face registration, fees, and waste partnerships. And in 2028, 2030, packaging and packaging waste regulation labeling requirements start becoming applicable, as well as the recyclability and reuse milestones, which means companies must keep an eye on them to be ready to redesign their packaging, and the information they need to comply with these milestones is ready to be reported.